so much. And those talks are so insightful. Also, thank you, Martin, for making me a title slide, because I just put shapes on. So yeah, I'm Laurence. I'm a service designer. I'm not in the UK government, although you've given it away that I used to be. I used to be on the international team with Paloma. And yeah, I work with governments around the world who are starting their digital transformation journey. I've worked with governments who are trying to put in place building blocks that allow them to deliver user-centered services. So all the stuff that Paloma and Kara has talked about already. So things like design systems, service standards, procurement reform, digital skills and job families and things like that. But today I want to talk to you a little bit about a project that I'm working on called GovStack. So GovStack's an open source project that helps reduce the cost, time, and resources required for government to create digital platforms and services. So we've talked a lot about all the leadership and capability stuff that needs to happen. This is more about technical building blocks that can support governments who are looking to build a digital service. So I'll talk give some examples in a minute. This open source project is made up of people from different governments, global companies, and startups as well. So it's really, it's a really interesting project. There's people on the working groups from in India, Bangladesh, Argentina, really around the world, which makes scheduling meetings actually impossible. I originally signed up to this project with an hour and a half a week available, and just trying to find time took more than that. But there's some useful websites that can help. So GovStack develops specifications for reusable building blocks, and these form the foundations of digital services. So there's about 15 working groups working on building blocks like payment, consent management, notification systems, digital marketplaces. They're not necessarily building a digital marketplace or a payment platform. They're writing the specifications. So if a government wants to, they can use different technology to put together that platform. So it's really documentation. So each of these building blocks, they look like specifications for APIs and things like that. They don't have a front end necessarily. So I was asked to come in and help with the UX UI working group. And the role of that working group is to make it simple to build services using those building blocks that are accessible and meet users' needs. And we're a tiny group at the moment. We started as a very international group, but currently we've got Jaquita, who's helping us with prototyping. So we're testing patterns, which I'll talk about, and she's helping prototype. There's me, and there's Betty as well, who's also at the Government Digital Service. So this stuff might look familiar, but back when, if we go back to thinking about the UK government, they have a design system supported by a team, community managers. They also have standards to kind of enforce the use of certain ways of working, being user-centered, doing research. And that all comes with guidance, blog posts, YouTube videos, communities. So the UK government's had about 10 years to develop this, and it really is a luxury. This is great. This is amazing. But how can we support countries that don't have these resources at the moment? Recently, I've seen other organizations like Jabar Digital Service in Indonesia, Digital Services Factory in Cyprus, and the Digital Agency in Japan. They're using Figma to create design systems. So whilst they're building up the buy-in or maybe the time to build a design system with developers, they're documenting patterns that are being used across government. They're trying to kind of build consistency and build trust for services with their users. But again, these countries have the skill sets, the specialists needed to be able to take this forward independently. That's Jabar's. So GovStack is working with countries that may not have well-developed digital economies. Therefore, attracting talent might be difficult or impossible. maybe the people in the country don't exist yet. And in some cases, their services are built by suppliers. In other cases, they have teams of maybe self-taught developers. In places where I've worked, I've found that the developers are really good. They've got a great mentality. They've had lots of support, but if they run into a problem or they're not sure about something, they find it really hard to get past that, because reading the internet is mostly in English. So trying to find good documentation or having that mental energy when you've been told you need to deliver 500 digital services in the next year is impossible. Yeah, it's really impossible because they need a lot more support. But there's some positives as well. So in cases like Somalia, for example, they're not really in a position of transforming existing digital government. They don't have lots of, like thousands of old government websites like that we did in the UK. They maybe have 200 websites. So they're kind of starting from scratch, which is where GovStack kind of comes in and is really useful, I think. But before jumping into design systems or standards, they need to have the basic foundations like guidance for developing a style guide. How do you make services look consistent? Or what is the user-centered design process? Once those foundations are in place, perhaps they can put together a central team to develop and maintain standards across services, likely working with in-house teams or probably suppliers. So how can suppliers build government things in a consistent way? And these teams, I imagine, will probably also be in charge of things like procurement reform, because it's about working with suppliers and changing the way government is built digitally. And beyond that, maintaining consistency and reducing the workload. Every service the government builds, they don't want their suppliers or their teams to think about what font to use or what variation of the color, or maybe they're not thinking about what variation, they're just picking a blue. So it got me thinking about maybe this working group is about a kind of starter kit for governments. So I wonder if it's possible to develop a starter kit for government based on what governments have successfully implemented around the world. So this has taken us a while to get to, but our working group's current focus is on putting together a template checklist to meet standards like accessibility or gender and social inclusion. Also thinking about foundational guidance to be able to meet those standards, which comes along with in-country support as well. So GovStack has a program of in-country support. And also reusable patterns, like making a payment or asking for consent. So at the moment, I'm thinking a starter kit for government doesn't look like a design system. We don't know what technology they'll build it in. We don't know what their styles look like. But we know what common journeys look like through government services. Other organizations like the OECD have already looked at developing publishing standards for designing services. But this is aimed at governments with more resources or people with more digital skills to navigate those standards. So we started to develop this super simple, and as you can see, it's a work in progress. Well, I'll call it a simple template standard. Each of these points leads to a subpage of guidance, which we start to develop. So the aim of this project is not to create new guidance, it's to kind of bring together what already exists. So rather than spending our time in the working group coming up with how should you test with users, there's already really good guidance out there. So it's about bringing that together in maybe a format that makes sense for people. And to support accessible and usable services, we're documenting common patterns. So we want to, like I said, we don't want to define their look and feel. We don't even want to say how you should do something. This is just if you're looking at a registration journey, perhaps this is what it looks like. And each of these things link back to one of the building blocks that GovStack's developing. For example, consent management or authentication. So our focus at the moment is working on patterns that make up the registration journey. And we're prototyping this with real services currently apply for a construction permit. But there's other live services that are being developed within GovStack so that we can iterate our guidance. Here's an example of a pattern. This is asking for consent. So there might be a flow to explain where this might get used in a user journey. There might be a wireframe to explain what makes up the content. This is a bit pixely, maybe that's good for me. And maybe there's a mock-up, so you can actually see what that looks like with real content in there. At the moment, we've got loads of challenges. I've already mentioned the time availability. GovStack's very technology focused, and the working groups themselves don't have embedded designers yet. It takes time to document these patterns, even if we're documenting patterns from other places. We're kind of, for consent perhaps, or a start page for a government service, we might look to gov.uk guidance on the design system, but we might also align it to the building blocks within GovStack to make sure it kind of works with the other guidance that we're publishing. And we need more outside input. We want to get a bit more diverse and get out of this UK bubble. So we're highly influenced by things like the gov.uk patterns and places where I've worked as well. So I really want to open this up to more people. And this is the first time I've started talking about this project publicly. So hopefully we can start a process of getting more people involved. People like researchers, tech writers, content designers. Yeah, like I said, this is a lot of work, and being part of the working group doesn't mean you're having to dedicate 2 days a week to writing documentation. Maybe you are. Maybe you could attend the weekly or bi-weekly feedback sessions that we do and be able to feed into the patterns that we're developing. Or maybe you want to get involved in working in country or with countries and testing some of this stuff. Thank you, but if you want to get involved, there's a tiny URL here. You can find out more about GovStack on govstack.global, and you can find me down here. Well, thank you.